That would have been helpful.
That's okay. Thank you, Corey, so much for that kind introduction, and thank you, Amy, for all your help. Thank you for inviting me here. I am so humbled to be in front of you today and to see some unexpected friends from the past that are here. This is such an esteemed group. Very honored. Cody is a really special place to me also because I actually conducted the field work for my dissertation research about 30 miles north of here near Belfry, Montana. And of course, Cody's just extraordinarily beautiful. I love this museum. I love this community, so I'm very happy to be here. So in today's talk, I would like to invite you into an in-depth journey into the sagebrush steppe. Now, I really feel like this is a highly underappreciated system. In fact, I've heard people call the sagebrush steppe things like, oh, that's just drive-through country, or that's just a barren wasteland. Or maybe you've heard the analogy of the sagebrush sea. Now, when you look out across the surface of a sea, things at first might look sort of homogeneous, right? But that superficial perspective can really, it belies the actual complexity and cool things that are going on out there in the sagebrush. And I hope to give you some examples of that today and convince you that actually this is a really special system. There are a lot of, we all know the importance of our open spaces and our wildlands for the large hooved tasty things like our pronghorn and our bison and our elk and our mule deer. I'm not really going to talk about those guys today. I'm going to delve into some lesser, probably known species and some of the cool behaviors that they exhibit, and also some conservation challenges. So it's sort of a shocking number, but the sagebrush steppe is actually home to over 630 species of plant and animal species of concern, including many habitat specialists. So types of animals that are only found within this type of system and nowhere else. So some examples of this, the pygmy rabbit. This is the smallest rabbit species in the world. They burrow, they're in our sagebrush steppe all year long. Fascinating species. Turns out they're actually thermally sensitive to high temperatures, much like our pikas in the alpine. So we've initiated a new study on that with a new student. Some birds that I'm going to be talking about a lot today. This is a suite of what we call sagebrush obligate songbirds. So the brewer sparrow, the sagebrush sparrow, and the sage thrasher. And of course, I'm sure everybody has heard about and appreciates the amazing sage-grouse. This is a fantastic lecking species. Also not really going to talk too much about sage-grouse today because let's just say there are a lot of cooks in that kitchen. But one thing that's pretty significant to talk about when it comes to sage-grouse is a lot of folks mention that sage-grouse is this umbrella species for the conservation and management of a whole bunch of other co-occurring species of, say, non-hunted wildlife. And this is an appealing concept, right? Because resources for research and conservation and management are very limited. So if we can just focus our management on this wide-ranging other sagebrush specialists, maybe we can just de facto be taking care of all these other species. Well, my PhD student, Jason Carlisle, and I wanted to take a deep dive into this concept to make sure that this was a safe assumption. Unfortunately, at smaller spatial scales, that umbrella concept collapsed, if you will, because there was really low congruence in terms of the areas where you had higher abundance, preferred nesting habitats, and places with higher nest success between grouse and the songbird species. So in my mind, this really suggests that the direct study and biological understanding of other sagebrush species of concern is therefore warranted. So this is my student Claire Kuhn, who I just mentioned is starting a pygmy rabbit project. And I have accordingly spent, gosh, the last over 20 years of my career now, at least partly focused on the study of the behavior, ecology, and habitat relationships of sagebrush songbirds and other sagebrush wildlife. So sagebrush songbirds are essentially snowbirds. Before there was the human concept of snowbirds, these birds fly up from their southern breeding grounds every spring to our sagebrush habitats in Wyoming. And so let's dive into some cool factoids about the breeding biology of these birds. So this is a male brewer sparrow. And what's cool about them is that when they first arrive on spring breeding grounds, they sing this very repetitive short song over and over. Maybe you've heard this before out in the sage. So then, when this male here pairs with a female in the spring and they begin a nest, he switches to this crazy elaborate long song. Goes on and on forever. This has always been sort of counterintuitive to me, because why would you, after you get your wife and you don't no longer need to impress her, why do you then switch to this crazy, probably energetically expensive long song? So it's still sort of a mystery, but super cool. Okay, so this is my favorite time of year because it means that soon I get to go out and wander around in the sagebrush and find nests. I have probably found thousands of these things, and it never gets old. Raise your hand if you see the brewer sparrow nest in this shrub. A few hands. So it's right there in the center, and I'm going to zoom in here and you can see the female incubating. Yeah, they're very cryptic. And then here's a sage thrasher nest. They are a lot bigger, about this yay big, constructed of sticks. Here's a visual of all three examples of nests from all three of these birds. One interesting thing you might notice about these nests is that some of them are bright blue and some are that sort of drab tan. This is actually a fairly common phenomenon in songbirds, is that you either have these sort of tannish drab eggs or you have these bright blue eggs. So what the heck is that about? And indeed, this is one of an ongoing sort of mystery in biologists. There's one prevailing hypothesis that suggests that the blue color helps protect egg contents from UV light. But then that begs the question, how come they're not all blue? So this is, again, an ongoing mystery biologically, but they're beautiful. So here are pictures of all three of these adult birds. Unfortunately, all three of them have been demonstrating population declines. These are data from the US GS Breeding Bird Survey for about the last 50 years. These trends parallel, I don't know, maybe some of you saw that paper that came out by Ken Rosenberg and other colleagues in the journal Science that talked about 3 billion birds lost over since about 1970. So these arid land birds are no exception. And so why is this happening? This is essentially the historic extent of sagebrush steppe, but the green colors represent areas where we still have large tracts of contiguous sage, and the warmer colors represent areas where there's been a lot more habitat loss and fragmentation. About 50% of sagebrush steppe has been entirely converted. That number might be higher now. One thing you might notice is that Wyoming seems to be doing pretty well. I mean, look at that. Wyoming has one of the last bastions of quite beautiful, intact sagebrush landscapes. So for better or for worse, I think that puts a great responsibility on us to be wise stewards of these remaining lands. So you might be thinking, well, so in Wyoming, why do we care about this? We have a lot of remaining sagebrush. A lot of it's very pristine, especially some of the mesic habitats that are in Grand Teton National Park, just juicy, beautiful sagebrush. Well, this is the extent of, a map of the extent of sagebrush in Wyoming. But this is what happens when you overlay the currently either actively producing or authorized, so this is approved, oil and natural gas wells in our state. And so you can see there's a lot of coincidence in this, which poses a conservation and management challenge. So we started studying these birds when I began my job at the University of Wyoming. This is now the longest running sagebrush songbird study, which I'm very proud about. It's a pretty long study by any ecological stretch. So I just zoomed you into one of our plots, which is on the Jonah natural gas field just south of Pinedale, Wyoming. This is where we've been studying since 2008. This is a still image of what some of these landscapes look like. So you can see there's quite a bit of change that's happened, some habitat loss and some fragmentation that's happened within these places. So in the first phase of the work, we learned that songbirds were less abundant in areas that were surrounded by more development. So here I've just shown you an example of the sagebrush sparrow. And these are data spanning a decade. So in 2008 and 9 on the left, and then 2018 and 19, we revisited. These are my students, Michelle Gilbert and Max Carlin. The next step was, okay, well, how are the birds actually doing there? And in this phase of the work, we found that the nest survival of all three species decreased along that x-axis of surrounding surface disturbance associated with development. And you might not understand the math on the x-axis there in terms of that daily nest survival probability that us bird nerds use, but what this equates to is out on the right side of these figures at the highest ends of surrounding disturbance. That's only about 14% nest survival of brewer sparrows, 17% for sagebrush sparrows, and 5% for sage thrashers. So the next step was to figure out what was going on. The main cause of nest failure was predation. Now, these videos get a little gruesome, so take care if you need to. This is a loggerhead shrike taking a nestling. And you want to guess what species that is? Someone said a deer mouse. Good job. This is probably my favorite video. It's kind of a bull in a china shop approach of a badger on a sage thrasher nest. So this is a northern harrier female, and she first tries to come in bill first, and she couldn't reach because that shrub was so dense. So then this video is clipped, but later on she comes in talons first and takes the nestlings. So yeah, this is nature red in tooth and claw. Does anyone want to hazard a guess in terms of what was the singly most important nest predator that we captured on about 75 of these videos that we have? No snakes at this site, but that's a good guess. In other places, snakes are primary predators. I don't know if Doug is cheating, but he's right. It is the deer mouse, so that was really counterintuitive to me. And so that brought us into the next phase of our work. Oh, here's another video. This just shows you how industrious and aggressive these little critters can be. So this was a mouse that came in. These nestlings here were old enough to force fledge. So what this mouse does is come and he or she maims each one of the nestlings and then comes back sequentially and removes these nestlings. So you really get an inside look with these videos in terms of what's going on out there behaviorally. Okay, so what's going on with the predators themselves? trying to get at the root of the issue. I'm a really big fan of understanding mechanism and ecology, because I feel like if you understand not just what's happening, but why, it can really lead you to potentially more effective mitigation measures. And plus, it's just interesting scientifically. So here we found in the next phase that indeed the abundance of most of these rodent nest predators also increased in abundance along that same surface disturbance gradient associated with development. And just to cross our T's and dot our I's here and bring it full circle, more rodents in an area indeed was correlated with decreased nest survival. Well, so maybe you're wondering, well, what the heck, what is it about natural gas fields that's leading to higher rodent populations? So that was our next phase. This is my student, Lindsay Sanders, master's student. She tested a couple of different hypotheses to explain this. One was she called the mesopredator release hypothesis. So here the idea was that maybe the predators of the mice, for some reason, were less abundant or avoiding these natural gas areas, thereby releasing rodents from predation and leading to larger population sizes. And then therefore that was putting pressure on nests. I'm just going to summarize here that this is not what we found, that actually we got all sorts of cool pictures of, canids and coyotes and badgers, and we surveyed for corvids and hawks and eagles. All of those groups themselves were actually a little bit more abundant in terms of their detections in these areas. So we rejected that hypothesis. The other thing that we wondered about is that in these development fields, operators are required to reseed areas or reclaim them after they come in and they clear pipelines or well pads. And so oftentimes these areas adjacent, you can see here a line adjacent to some undisturbed patch, an undisturbed patch of sage. You can see it looks really different. And they're kind of all over the map. It just depends on which seeds they're able to get in a particular year, et cetera. So here we wondered, well, maybe these areas are providing a juicy source of seeds for food, or simultaneously providing them some cover, which is kind of supporting them more from the bottom up. And these reseeded areas actually can comprise a fairly large proportion of these landscapes. So we thought this could be a possibility of serving as an attractant. Whoops, wrong direction. So here the hypothesis was that these reseeded areas with these often bigger, juicier plants might be providing a novel food source for these rodents and these landscapes, therefore making them, supporting them in terms of food resources and making, maybe increasing their reproduction, which again would put more pressure on nests. And here we had support for this idea. So we found that the abundance of these mice increased with the amount of reclaimed area or these reseeded areas, but not just in areas that had roads or well pads. It was specifically, they were attracted to these areas that had more of this reseeded area. And just to make sure that we document that these animals were indeed entering these areas and using them, etc. Lindsay coated some of these captured mice with fluorescent powder and then released them, and we went back at night and they leave this trail that you can see with the black light, so you can kind of get an inside look at where they went and how far they traveled. And so we learned, yes, that both they were entering and using these areas, but we also learned that these suckers are traveling a much longer distance than really people had recorded before. So it's kind of amazing that these songbirds are successful at all when you have these industrious little suckers that are abundant and out there covering a lot of ground, going up into the shrubs, etc. We also documented using some whiz-bang DNA metabarcoding in the feces of the mice. We documented that they were indeed foraging and consuming a lot of the non-native plants that you see in these reseeded areas, but not in the adjacent sagebrush. So, in summary of this body of work, we found this mechanistic pathway for these the results of natural gas development on this suite of birds. So in particular, natural gas development was leading to these areas that were reseeded post soil disturbance, led to more increased abundance of rodent nest predators and elevated rates of nest predation, resulting in fewer offspring produced, which can affect populations. Okay, so what the heck can we do about this? Obviously, our sagebrush lands are meant for multi-use. So what are some of the potential mitigation regimes we could think about if people care about declining songbirds? Well, we did an experiment where we went out and experimentally reduced the abundance, trapped out a bunch of mice in some plots and not in other plots. And as you can hopefully tell in this figure, there was absolutely no difference between that removal treatment and control areas that had more mice. And this was happening because mice were coming back into our study plots, new mice, as fast as we could trap them out, even though we had an intensive trap regime. And also likely there was compensatory mortality, such that if mice predators didn't find these nests, then other species of predator probably did. So that's not really an option. So the other thing we can think about is reducing our initial disturbance footprints, whether it's in relation to energy development or other sources of landscape change. Indeed, some of this has been happening in recent years with the advent of things like directional drilling, where they can reach a lot further underground and have less of a surface footprint, which is great. The other thing that I think could be really great is if we could put more thought and investment into improvements into our restoration efforts, instead of just being happy with, okay, we reseeded it with something. Really thinking a little bit more mindfully about how can we get this to resemble, once these wells are plugged and done, because they don't go on forever. In fact, in these gas fields, new development peaked in about 2008 and 2009. And so it's been slowing down. So in theory, we could restore improve our restoration efforts such that these areas resemble more closely what they used to, and then we might not get these kind of trophic imbalances and big changes in the wildlife community out there. So the other thing that I wanted to emphasize within sagebrush landscapes is that the sagebrush sea actually has a lot more habitat variation than maybe people typically think about. So this is a photo of a pronghorn doe, obviously on the left, and my beloved dog Izzy on the right, standing next to some super tall tree-like sage. And these places, like the one where Izzy is, turns out are really interesting special places, and yet they're now exceedingly rare on the landscape because they tend to also be where you get nice, well-drained, wetter soil and things like that are also the more arable areas, and also they just really haven't been much of a focus to managers. But we're finding lots of reasons why these are really important areas within sagebrush landscapes. So for one thing, my student Eric Schoenborn did a recent analysis with all of our long-term nesting data and found that all three of these songbirds there's a higher probability that they will select areas for nesting if there's more variation in sagebrush canopy height. So not just those homogeneously short, sparser areas, but they're preferring to nest in areas which have variation. They have some of that taller, high cover sage. Another line of evidence, and this goes way back now to some of my PhD research, which I observed anecdotally that brewer sparrows, they would, if their first nest failed, their first nesting attempt, I anecdotally noticed that the next attempt, the gestalt, if you will, of that nest patch would look really different a lot of times than the first. So it's like, I wonder if they are employing this behavioral strategy where it's a win, stay, lose switch. If they try out a particular patch structure and they're successful, they do that again. If they fail, then they really change up the structure of that nest patch. So I'm bringing this up because this is another reason why biologically it's important to have that variation out there on the landscape to facilitate these behavioral strategies. Super interesting. And I think they're doing this because they cannot evaluate. It's not possible given all the diversity of types of predators out there and the different foraging modalities that they have. You know, some are aerial, some are from the ground, some are active at night, some are active during the day, etc. Some are olfactory predators. How do you possibly anticipate in a given year what predation rates are going to be like? So they employ this cool behavioral strategy. Another thing that we found is that study plots that had a greater diversity of nest heights within them had lower overall rates of nest predation. And my thinking here is that this acts to preclude the ability of nest predators from developing really specific search images, and it makes them less successful. So lots of reason why these areas with diverse canopy heights are super important within sagebrush. These areas, and a lot of times you'll see these washes, for example, along which you see that really tall, high cover sage growing. Well, these are also really special places because you get other things happening such that, for example, in the spring, this is where we see a lot of migrant songbirds using these areas, much like they do a riparian area. So we've seen tanagers flying up these areas, all sorts of other like weird forest birds, like thrushes, super cool. Also, this is where loggerhead shrikes nest in some of those big tree-like shrubs. This is a nest chock full of shrike nestlings, all facing out like they're in a pie, kind of. We also have some ongoing research on shrikes. Super interesting bird. They're the bird that take prey items and sort of cache them around their territories. So if you're ever out in the sage, or you see like on the wire of barbed wire, you might see a grasshopper or a rodent or even a songbird. That's shrikes. And they're doing that to sort of delineate their territory and maybe also try to impress females. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the breeding period of these birds, because that's when they're up here in Wyoming and we can observe them. But the breeding period, in reality, is a very small part of the annual cycle of these birds, right? It's only about a third of their year. In August and September, October, these birds take off and do a fall migration down to their overwintering sites. I'm going to talk about that in a second, some exciting news for you. And then spring migration happens, and a lot of times these tiny little birds are coming back to the exact same nesting areas where we're able to resite them and study them again. So I also want to point out this period immediately preceding nesting, which is that post-fledging period. And so it turns out that these birds have a very rapid nesting period. There must be a lot of pressure for them to develop quickly because they're subject to a lot of nest predation, right? And so my PhD student, Emily Schertzer, has been expanding our research outside of the nesting period to understand, for example, what is survival like during that also vulnerable period when these birds leave nests. And because it turns out that survival during the post-fledging period is even lower than it is during the nestling period. So kind of another gauntlet that these birds are going through. And it turns out that there are carryover effects from development in the nest and whether those birds survive or not. So for example, birds that develop longer tarsi, so that's essentially the leg of the bird. In other studies, it's been more wing length that's been associated with post-fledging survival. But what's interesting is it makes sense when you think about it, because these birds, when they leave the nest, they're not capable of sustained flight for up to a week. So they are extremely vulnerable. So maybe if they have longer, more well-developed tarsi, then they're able to scramble away more effectively. Birds also that have greater feather development at a set age are more likely to survive inclement weather conditions, so cold snaps. That's another reason why a lot of fledglings perish. So again, because we're a mechanistic thinking lab, now the question is, well, what influences what traits nestlings develop while they're in the nest? And so my student Don Jones, who just finished up, did some really cool work on a really disgusting phenomena, which is these parasitic bird blowflies. These flies lay their larvae in the nest lining of sagebrush songbird nests and those of a lot of other species. And they go subcutaneous and they grow these maggots. And we reasoned that, gosh, certainly that must affect growth and maybe survival. And it turns out that it does. And kind of wondering whether these blowflies are becoming more and more abundant in certain contexts. Also, temperature can influence nestling development. So nestlings that develop in warmer conditions develop longer wings, which again generally is associated with evading predators. And nestlings that develop in colder temperatures invest more in body condition. Presumably that helps them make it through those cold snaps. So super cool biology. My brand new student, Olivia Baudet, is studying something that you might think, gosh, surely you understand what these birds eat or what the parents are feeding their nestlings. But some of this basic biology we still don't know. So that's what we're tackling now, is trying to understand what arthropod or insect prey parents are feeding to nestlings, and how does that influence nestling traits, and how are those preferred foods distributed across those same sorts of habitat gradients and disturbance gradients. So I'm excited to tell you that we also have expanded even outside the post-fledging period and have been taking advantage of the latest technologies. We finally have some options to be able to track these tiny birds after they leave nests. And so on the left here, this is what's called the light level geolocator. These are little pods that you can put a little backpack harness on these birds. And light level geolocators record the timing of sunset and sunrise, and that roughly correlates with the latitude and the longitude. So then when we recapture these birds, yes, you have to recapture these tiny birds after they do their whole annual cycle and come back. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to do this, but we were successful. We also have been using standard technologies like putting unique color band combinations on the legs of birds so we know if they've come back and they've survived. And then also we're using these MODIS tags, which speak to a node of stations on our plots and triangulate so we can get a picture, for the first time, an understanding of their movements, and then when they leave our breeding sites and if and when they come back. And we can calculate adult survival and site fidelity back to our sites. So it's a very exciting time in the lab. And this is a video of a sagebrush sparrow who's been newly tagged with one of those geolocators and safely flies off. So this is just a picture of my student Emily and I celebrating over champagne the day that we received our first recapture of one of these birds with the geolocator, because we didn't know if we were going to be able to do this. It was so exciting in a nerdy way. Okay, so here are some of these data that we've been able to collect, and we know now for the first time where these birds are roughly migrating and where they're overwintering. So each one of these colored dots and lines is a bird of the 3 species, and we can see, them leave our western Wyoming field sites and go down to these various southern areas. And basically before, people were just making assumptions about specifically where they were going. So now we know that one of the hot spots is the Sonoran Desert in Mexico, the Chihuahuan Desert, and then some parts of southeast Texas. That's where a lot of the shrikes are going as well, to southeast Texas. But one really interesting thing we learned from this too, we had 9 different individuals that we had 2 subsequent years of tagging. So we asked, I wonder if they go back to the same overwintering sites like they do to the breeding sites. And it turns out 8 of the 9 birds were not, which is a little bit mind-blowing. So they don't have, these purple circles here, that's, for example, one tiny brewer sparrow. In the 2 different years of his tag, his 2 sites were 900 kilometers away from each other. It's crazy. So, it's fascinating in terms of the behavior and how the heck they're doing this and how they're making these choices. But to me, it also, because they're not just going to one very specific overwintering sites, suggests that our work on the breeding sites has been incredibly important in terms of influencing populations. So I really hope that by giving you a little snapshot of some of the incredible phenomena that go on out in the sagebrush and some of the behaviors and lesser known critters that maybe you don't typically think about, that I've convinced you that this certainly is not a barren wasteland or just drive through a country. And I hope maybe next time you're out in or near some sagebrush steppe, maybe you'll hear the long song of a brewer sparrow and know, no, he's got a nest in there. That's cool. Or think about like, wow, that bird just came all the way back from Mexico and maybe was here last year too. So there's a lot of text on the slide, but I just wanted to make sure that I didn't forget to say any of these points. So some broader implications that I think we can think about are that human activities can create these ecological imbalances, often in these really counterintuitive ways, but that everything is really interconnected within these landscapes. And I really think that this sequential, mechanistic, and long-term inquiry can really clarify the why of why we're seeing what we're seeing, and not just, there's some sort of an effect. And that can really, even though there's, that necessitates an upfront investment, that really will make our management interventions that much more efficient and successful by having that inside look in terms of what's going on. I also think that many people care broadly, including people in this room, otherwise you wouldn't be here, about our wildlife and wildlands. I'm sure you guys probably know that tourism in Wyoming is the second largest economy. And birding in the US is a multi-billion-dollar economy, which is kind of mind-blowing. So people do care about all wildlife in Wyoming and beyond. And so I think it's important for us to think about being wise stewards to facilitate multiple uses of our lands. So in closing, I wanted to acknowledge a large cohort of really amazing, bright graduate students that I've had the privilege of working with. Also want to thank our funding support over the years, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, the Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative, the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, scholarships from the University of Wyoming, and increasingly more NGOs and private donations. So Audubon Society, the Megan Burt Rains Foundation out of Jackson has been incredible to us. Bernie McHugh recently gave us a nice gift to support our research. Also doing some work with the Ricketts Foundation. So very appreciative to all of you. And I just wanted to leave you with this poem that I recently came across. Actually, my mom sent it to me. Shout out to Mom. And it's a poem by Kate Forster entitled Entanglement. And she says, I think it's a deep consolation to know that spiders dream, that monkeys tease predators, that dolphins have accents, that otters hold hands, and ants bury their dead, that there isn't their life and our life, nor your life and my life, that it's one just teetering and endless thread, and all of us entangled with it as deep as entanglement goes. So I think this sort of epitomizes that interconnectedness that ecological research shows us, and also why I became a wildlife biologist. Thank you so much. Happy to take any questions that you have. Yes?
I'm curious about the restoration of these sites, obviously some are untied and probably in the state and so on. And just what are the requirements if the wrong things are being seen with restoration, but what can be done to promote native species?
Yeah, so the question was about the restoration efforts that happen in these areas that have surface disturbance with development and other things. And the reality is that right now there's inconsistency in terms of requirements. They're not required to, beyond just, I think, getting revegetated to a certain extent. And it can be very difficult to get that exact composition of grasses and forbs and get that sagebrush reestablished, et cetera, for people that really have limited resources. But I think a really neat next step would be for folks like me to partner with folks that were interested in the science and technology of how can we do a better job and more effective job at actual restoration rather than just reseeding it. Yeah, it's a great question.
So do you think the thing is to plant sagebrush, which I've heard that some people do on some sites with shrubs? Is that the way to get more done there?
I do think that the sagebrush cover is absolutely imperative, and the efficacy of restoring sagebrush shrubs is highly dependent on the conditions that year. So if they happen to reseed, maybe some folks in the audience might know more about this than I do, but if you happen to replant during a year where there's some good water, then you actually can see those shrubs come back like bananas. So the shrub layer is important, but I think also trying to more closely mimic those understory plants as well would limit the extent to which we get these weird trophic changes. Thank you. Yes?
This is not so much about the wildlife, but the sea itself. When you see it, it looks like it could be seen the top of a big tall horse. You don't
Yeah.
have those, you top where you're at really. So
Yeah.
is it also the sea a carbon sink, so it takes it a while
Oh, wow.
to decompose, and then when it's disturbed for oil and gas, that then creates more release of carbon into the atmosphere,
Yeah, so the question is that the sagebrush sea also might be important in terms of them resembling mini trees and whether they might be important for things like, yeah, carbon sequestration. That is outside my area of expertise, but that's a fascinating concept. I don't know exactly how, like, the physiology of sagebrush shrubs, Artemisia tridentata shrubs, in terms of carbon, but that's very interesting, and I would like to look into that some more. Yeah. Yes. Oh, good. Ooh. So there was an anecdote about yes. And the smell of sagebrush, there's nothing like it. I do this silly thing where I don't even notice I'm doing it, but when I'm walking around in the sagebrush, I'll grab a few leaves and crush them and smell them. It's so divine. Yeah, but I wonder if in that context, did your shrub have inflorescences at the top, so seed stalks at the top? Yeah, I wonder if that you had some seeds established. That's neat. Gave it back in spades. Wonderful. Yay. Yeah, a moderate amount of water is fine. We're actually seeing in some places sagebrush die-offs because of times when you get a lot of precipitation at weird times, then their root systems get inundated. And unlike when they're sort of deciduous, so they can get defoliated from hot weather, for example, but they're not dead. But those weird intense precip events have, if you see just a standing dead patch of sage, it's probably like a strange water event that they doesn't come back from very well. Yes?
Specifically interested in your deer study. What were you finding? Like how many kilometers were they traveling from their nest?
Yeah, so the question was about deer mice and a general sense for how the distances they were traveling. So with that powder tracking technique, of course, we only see, gosh, I don't know, maybe a half an hour of time or something before the powders sort of fizzles out. But we were finding like 200, 300 meter tracks, and previous estimates, maybe because this was from forested habitats, like more productive, they had quantified very small home ranges, like much smaller than that. So they're probably traveling at least twice that distance in a night, 400 or so meters. Yeah, it's like a quarter mile. Okay, thank you guys so much.